In the summer of 1966, a saxophonist stood on a stage in California and did something no jazz musician had done before him. He made the hippies scream. 60,000 people, flowers in their hair, and a jazz quartet playing a song so hypnotic it outsold albums by the Rolling Stones that year.
But he watches so sad.
For one strange decade, jazz didn't live in smoky basement clubs. It lived on the radio, right next to the Beatles and the Beach Boys. Saxophone players had top 10 hits. Organ trios outsold rock bands. A blind girl from Brazil could stop a room with one verse. Tonight, we're counting down 12 of those songs, and the 12 human beings behind them. A preacher's son who accidentally invented a genre. A welder who became a guitar god and died at the height of his fame. A festival jam session that wasn't even supposed to happen. These aren't just songs that disappeared. These are careers that burned white hot and then went dark. And the stories of why. I'm your host, and this is Sax Appeal. Let's start the countdown.
I hate the human love of that stinking
Number 12. Jimmy McGriff, I've Got a Woman. Jimmy McGriff wasn't supposed to be a musician at all. He grew up in Philadelphia, and before he ever sat down at a Hammond organ professionally, he was a police officer, patrolling the same streets where he'd later play the clubs. He also served in the Korean War, carrying an instrument he'd taught himself back home. McGriff came up through soul, gospel, and the blues clubs of Philly, and it shows in everything he played. Heavy, greasy, danceable. In 1962, he took Ray Charles's I've Got a Woman and stripped it down to pure organ groove. No vocals needed. It became an enormous jukebox and radio hit, climbing onto the pop charts at a time when almost no instrumental jazz record did that. For a few years, McGriff was everywhere, a symbol of a new sound called soul jazz, built for bars and dance floors, not concert halls. But soul jazz organ trios were a singles format in an industry rapidly moving toward albums and rock radio. By the early 1970s, the Hammond organ itself was falling out of fashion, replaced by electric keyboards. McGriff kept recording for decades, respected by musicians, but the mainstream spotlight never came back the same way. McGriff never fully disappeared. He kept working steadily into the 1990s, later teaming with saxophonist Hank Crawford for a well-regarded run of duo albums that reminded serious jazz listeners why he mattered. But reminding serious listeners is different from owning the pop charts, which he'd briefly done as a young man. He became a musician whose name lives entirely inside the genre, deeply respected by peers, sampled quietly by later producers, but a stranger to the public that once bought his records by the truckload. He died in 2008, having spent nearly 50 years playing the instrument that made him famous for roughly 5. Number 11, Herbie Mann, Comin' Home Baby. Herbie Mann built his entire career on an instrument jazz critics didn't take seriously, the flute. In the 1950s, that made him something close to a novelty act in the eyes of the jazz establishment. Mann didn't care. He traveled obsessively. Brazil, Africa, the Middle East, absorbing rhythms most American jazz musicians had never touched and folding them into his own sound years before world music was even a phrase anyone used. That restless curiosity paid off in 1961 with Comin' Home Baby, a slinky, bass-driven groove that became an actual pop hit, reaching the Billboard Top 40, nearly unheard of for a flute-led jazz instrumental. Mann became one of the most commercially successful jazz artists of the decade, selling more records than many of the genre's most celebrated names. But that commercial instinct is exactly what erased him from the jazz canon. As the 60s ended, Mann kept chasing the sound of the moment. Funk, disco, pop covers, and jazz purists, who already looked down on the flute, now dismissed him as a sellout entirely. His crossover hits kept his name on the radio for years, but they also meant that when jazz history got written, Herbie Mann was too commercial for the jazz books, and too jazz for the pop ones. He fell into the gap between both. Ironically, the very instincts that got him dismissed by critics are what modern listeners tend to admire most in hindsight. Long before world music sections existed in record stores, Mann was blending Brazilian rhythm, West African percussion, and Middle Eastern scales into American jazz, with genuine curiosity rather than novelty. In the 1970s, he even started his own label, Cocapelli, giving himself the freedom to keep experimenting without a major label demanding another hit. He kept performing until shortly before his death from prostate cancer in 2003, having spent 4 decades as one of the hardest musicians in American history to categorize. Number 10. Lou Donaldson, Alligator Boogaloo. Lou Donaldson spent the first part of his career being compared to Charlie Parker, a fair comparison, since his alto saxophone tone was steeped in the same bebop language. But by the mid-1960s, Donaldson made a decision that would define, and later erase, his commercial legacy. He leaned hard into groove. In 1967, almost by accident, Donaldson's band stumbled into a rhythm during a recording session that guitarist George Benson, then a young, largely unknown sideman in Donaldson's group, helped drive into something irresistible. The result, Alligator Boogaloo, became a dance floor phenomenon, a boogaloo jazz hybrid that got jukebox play in bars that had never spun a jazz record before. Donaldson had, in effect, helped invent a subgenre, jazz boogaloo, that briefly bridged soul music and jazz clubs across urban America. But boogaloo itself burned out fast, a Latin soul jazz fusion trend that record labels abandoned within a few years for funk and fusion. Donaldson, unlike some peers, refused to chase electric instruments or psychedelic production into the 1970s. He kept his sound essentially the same for decades. Donaldson's stubbornness eventually paid off in a way nobody could have predicted at the time. Decades after Alligator Boogaloo fell off the charts, its unmistakable groove became a favorite source for hip-hop and crate-digging producers in the 1990s, giving Donaldson a strange kind of posthumous relevance while he was still very much alive and touring. Famously blunt in interviews, he spent his later decades openly, often hilariously, dismissing musical trends he had no interest in chasing, cementing his reputation as jazz's most unapologetic elder statesman. Number 9. Grant Green, Idle Moments. Grant Green was, for a stretch of the early to mid-1960s, arguably the busiest guitarist in jazz. He appeared on dozens of Blue Note sessions, not just his own albums, but as the house guitarist backing saxophonists, organists, and singers across the label's roster. His playing was economical and blues-soaked, closer to a horn player's phrasing than the chord-heavy style of many of his guitar contemporaries. His 1965 recording, Idle Moments, a slow-building, 15-minute meditation with pianist Duke Pearson and vibraphonist Bobby Hutcherson, became one of the most quietly influential jazz recordings of the era, a favorite of musicians, even when it wasn't a commercial single. But Green's story took a darker turn as the decade wore on. He struggled with heroin addiction for years, a battle shared by a painful number of his generation, and it repeatedly derailed his career and health. Green pushed into funkier, more commercial territory in the early 1970s, trying to find an audience, but the toll of years of substance abuse had already done damage. He collapsed in his car in New York City in 1979 and died of a heart attack, only 43 years old. What could have been a decades-long second act instead became a legacy rediscovered almost entirely after his death, largely through hip-hop producers sampling his grooves. What makes Green's disappearance especially painful is how quietly it happened, even at the time. Unlike headline-grabbing jazz deaths, his passing barely registered outside the musician community that had relied on him for a decade of session work. There was no chart-topping hit tied to his name, just a guitarist's guitarist, admired intensely by peers, whose steady contribution to dozens of classic Blue Note records went largely uncredited by the wider public both before and after his death. Every one of these artists reached a peak most musicians never touch, and every one of them still ended up here this well. That's exactly why this channel exists. Jazz history is full of these stories, and most of them don't get told anywhere else. If you want to keep finding the ones history left behind, hit subscribe now, because the 6 artists still ahead of us include a death at the absolute height of fame, and one disappearance so complete it defines this entire list. Let's keep going. Number 8. Jimmy Smith, Walk on the Wild Side. Before Jimmy Smith, the Hammond B3 organ was mostly a church instrument or a novelty in small combos. Smith didn't just play it, he reinvented what it could do, developing a technique using the bass pedals and drawbars that essentially let him be his own rhythm section. When he arrived on the jazz scene in the mid-1950s, veteran musicians reportedly stood in shock watching him play. By the early 1960s, Smith had become one of the most commercially successful artists on Verve Records, and his instrumental version of Walk on the Wild Side, the theme from the controversial 1962 film of the same name, became a genuine hit, showcasing his ability to turn Hollywood orchestration into swinging, funky jazz that regular listeners, not just musicians, wanted to buy. Smith's success single-handedly launched an entire subculture of organ-based jazz trios that dominated black nightclubs and jukeboxes through the decade. Many other artists on this list owe their careers to the door he kicked open, but the instrument became his ceiling. As rock bands adopted cheaper electric organs and jazz splintered into fusion and free jazz, the Hammond B3 gradually became a relic. Smith kept performing until his death in 2005, revered by musicians, but the mainstream hit-making chapter had closed decades earlier. There's a bittersweet footnote tied directly to another name on this list. In the mid-1960s, Smith teamed up in the studio with guitarist Wes Montgomery for a pair of celebrated collaborative albums, pairing two of America's most commercially successful jazz instrumentalists at the very moment both of their genres were quietly approaching their commercial expiration date. Smith continued to influence generations of keyboardists, from Booker T. Jones to countless funk and R&B organists who never got the crossover spotlight Smith briefly held. Number 7. Ramsey Lewis, The In Crowd. Ramsey Lewis had already been recording as a serious, disciplined jazz pianist for nearly a decade before 1965. Respected, but not a star. Then, almost by accident, everything changed. Performing live at a Washington, D.C. club, Lewis's trio began covering a Dobie Gray R&B hit called The In Crowd, and the crowd's reaction was so electric that the live recording, capturing audience claps and shouts in real time, became the single. It shouldn't have worked as a jazz radio hit. It was loose, joyful, almost more of a party record than a serious jazz statement. But it rocketed up the charts, cracked the pop top 5, won Lewis a Grammy, and made him one of the only jazz pianists of the era to become a legitimate mainstream celebrity, touring alongside pop acts and appearing on national television. The very success of The In Crowd created a trap. Lewis's trio bassist and drummer, L.D. Young and Red Holt, left shortly after to form their own group, chasing that same commercial soul jazz sound, breaking up the chemistry that had made the original hit special. Lewis rebuilt with new players and kept working, moving toward funk and fusion through the 70s, but the specific cultural lightning of The In Crowd, a jazz trio genuinely topping the pop charts, never struck the same way again for him or almost anyone else in jazz. Unlike several names on this list, Lewis found a graceful second act, just a quieter one than the pop chart years. He became a fixture of Chicago's cultural life, eventually hosting his own long-running public radio program dedicated to jazz, mentoring younger musicians, and continuing to record steadily into his 80s. He was showered with honors late in life, including a National Endowment for the Arts Jazz Master distinction that recognized a career far deeper than one crossover hit. Number 6. Stan Getz and Astrud Gilberto, The Girl from Ipanema.
She walks just like a samba that swings so.
Astrud Gilberto wasn't supposed to be on the recording at all. In 1963, she was the wife of Brazilian guitarist João Gilberto, attending a New York session led by saxophonist Stan Getz to record bossa nova material with her husband and composer Antonio Carlos Jobim. She had no professional singing career, no recording contract, no real ambition to be a star, but producers needed an English-language vocal, and she happened to speak the language and happened to be in the room.
Oh, but he watches so sad.
Her hesitant, unpolished, almost whispered vocal on The Girl from Ipanema became one of the most recognizable recordings in American musical history, a worldwide smash that won the Grammy for Record of the Year and made bossa nova a genuine mainstream craze in the U.S. For Stan Getz, it was the biggest commercial moment of his life, bigger than anything he'd done in 2 decades of serious jazz work.
Doesn't see.
But the fallout was messy and human. Credit and royalty disputes frayed relationships, and Astrud herself, thrust overnight into fame with almost no preparation, found her later solo career permanently overshadowed by 3 minutes of accidental magic. She spent decades afterward trying to be taken seriously as an artist beyond that one song, largely without success in the eyes of the wider public. The song never vanished. The people who made it, in a real sense, did. Astrud built an actual solo career of her own, releasing well over a dozen albums across 3 decades, from jazz-pop collaborations to a surprising 1996 duet with George Michael. But nothing ever approached the cultural saturation of that one accidental recording. Stan Getz kept working at the highest levels of jazz for another quarter-century before his death from liver cancer in 1991. Astrud retired from performing by 2002 and withdrew from public life almost entirely, devoted to animal rights activism and visual art. She died in 2023 at 83, a quiet ending for a voice once inescapable on radios worldwide. Number 5. Vince Guaraldi, Cast Your Fate to the Wind. Vince Guaraldi was a working San Francisco jazz pianist, a longtime sideman for vibraphonist Cal Tjader, when in 1962 he recorded an album of bossa nova-inspired covers tied to the film Black Orpheus. Almost as an afterthought, he tucked one original composition onto the B-side of the single, a modest, melancholic little piano tune he'd written to fill space. Radio DJs, most notably in Sacramento, flipped the single over. Cast Your Fate to the Wind became a surprise hit, climbing the pop charts and winning the 1963 Grammy for Best Original Jazz Composition, beating out work that year by Thelonious Monk and Charles Mingus. For a musician who'd spent years as a respected but anonymous sideman, it was a transformation almost too strange to believe. Then came the twist that defines his legacy. A TV producer named Lee Mendelson heard the song on his car radio while driving across the Golden Gate Bridge, working on a documentary about cartoonist Charles Schulz. He tracked Guaraldi down and asked him to score the project. That led directly to A Charlie Brown Christmas in 1965. Music so ubiquitous, it's now heard every December in millions of homes. But the song most responsible for launching his career is now almost forgotten by the audience that unknowingly hums his other work every holiday season. He died suddenly in 1976, at just 47. By his own account, Guaraldi never resented the shift. Musicians who knew him described a man who genuinely loved that a jazz waltz written for a cartoon dog had reached more households than any straight jazz record could. He kept performing live throughout the Peanuts years, happily taking requests for Cast Your Fate to the Wind, comparing it, self-deprecatingly, to signing the back of a paycheck. Number 4. Cannonball Adderley, Mercy, Mercy, Mercy. Julian Cannonball Adderley arrived in New York in the mid-1950s with a nickname born from his prodigious appetite, Cannibal, softened into Cannonball, and an alto saxophone sound so joyful and immediate that Miles Davis brought him into the sextet that recorded Kind of Blue. By the mid-1960s, Adderley had built his own hugely popular quintet, one of the few jazz groups of the era that could genuinely fill concert halls. In 1966, his pianist Joe Zawinul, an Austrian immigrant who would later co-found Weather Report, brought in a gospel-tinged, electric piano-driven tune he'd written. Recorded live at a club in Chicago, Mercy, Mercy, Mercy became an enormous, genre-crossing hit, climbing into the pop top 20, an almost unheard-of feat for a straight-ahead acoustic jazz group in the rock-dominated mid-1960s. The song made Adderley a household name at the peak of a career built on decades of hard work and generosity, famous among musicians for mentoring younger players and speaking eloquently about jazz on television, becoming one of the genre's most articulate public ambassadors. But that success proved to be the ceiling, as jazz fractured into fusion, free improvisation, and rock crossover. Adderley's soulful, accessible style began to feel, unfairly, like a relic. He died suddenly of a stroke in 1975 at only 46, and much of his catalog slipped out of mainstream memory almost immediately after. Few musicians gave back to the genre the way Adderley did. Alongside his brother, cornetist Nat Adderley, who anchored his quintet for nearly 2 decades, Cannonball became one of jazz's most visible advocates on national television, patiently explaining improvisation to viewers who'd never heard a jazz record in their lives. Number 3. Les McCann and Eddie Harris, compared to what? Les McCann grew up poor in Lexington, Kentucky, one of 6 children, and clawed his way into jazz as a pianist and singer whose style leaned more toward raw, gospel-rooted soul than technical bebop precision, a choice that drew criticism from purists throughout his career. By 1969, he'd built a solid, respectable career, but nothing close to stardom. That June, at the Montreux Jazz Festival, McCann's trio was booked for its own set. Saxophonist Eddie Harris was invited by a producer to sit in almost as an afterthought. Extra money, nothing more. Trumpeter Benny Bailey, a longtime American expatriate in Europe, was talked into joining too, despite openly admitting the soul jazz style wasn't really his thing. The 5 musicians had never performed together. There was no rehearsal.
They really got to be some kind of nut.
What happened next became one of the most famous unplanned moments in jazz history, opening with a Gene McDaniel's protest song called Compared to What? A scathing commentary on Vietnam and American hypocrisy that McCann had played in clubs for years without much notice. The ad hoc group caught fire. McCann, by his own account, was disoriented, having lost enormous weight and tried hash for the first time that trip. The chaos became magic. The resulting album, Swiss Movement, went gold and turned the song into a generational anthem, the only major hit of McCann's career.
Goddamn nation looks like we always end up in a rut.
The song's afterlife turned out even stranger than its birth. Decades later, Compared to What? Became a favorite crate-digging source for hip-hop producers, sampled by artists from the notorious B.I.G. to Mobb Deep, quietly seeding the Montreux accident into a new generation of American music. McCann suffered a debilitating stroke in the mid-1990s that sidelined him for years, a devastating setback for a performer built around raw physical energy at the piano. Yet he willed himself back onto stages by 2002, determined not to let One Night in Switzerland be the final word. Number 2, Wes Montgomery, Going Out of My Head. Wes Montgomery didn't pick up a guitar seriously until 19 and never learned to read music. He taught himself to pluck the strings with the side of his thumb instead of a pick, reportedly so he wouldn't disturb his family playing late at night. For most of the 1950s, he worked as a welder, supporting his wife and 7 children, and played jazz clubs deep into the morning on almost no sleep. Cannonball Adderley discovered him by accident, catching a late-night set and insisting his own label sign him immediately. Through the early 1960s, Montgomery became recognized as one of the most innovative guitarists alive, celebrated for his signature use of octaves, a technique that influenced nearly every jazz guitarist who came after him. Then, around 1965, producer Creed Taylor steered Montgomery toward lush, orchestral covers of pop songs, stripped of improvisation, built for radio. It worked spectacularly. Going Out of My Head, and later Windy, became massive hits, putting Montgomery on TV variety shows and making him the best-selling jazz artist in America. It also cost him credibility with the jazz press, who accused him of selling out his gift. Montgomery never got to answer his critics with a late career reinvention. On June 15, 1968, 1 month after his final session, he woke up feeling unwell and suffered a fatal heart attack at home in Indianapolis. He was 45, at the commercial peak of his career, exhausted and overworked. Nearly 2,400 people attended his funeral, and within a few years, the pop hits that made him famous faded from radio entirely. Number 1. Charles Lloyd, Forest Flower. By 1966, Charles Lloyd had already played alongside some of the biggest names in jazz, including a stint with Cannonball Adderley's band. But nothing prepared anyone for what happened that September at the Monterey Jazz Festival, in the heart of California's emerging counterculture movement. Lloyd's Quartet, featuring a barely known 21-year-old pianist named Keith Jarrett, bassist Cecil McBee, and drummer Jack DeJohnette, performed an extended, hypnotic piece called Forest Flower. The mostly young, rock-oriented crowd reacted with the kind of ecstatic energy usually reserved for rock stars. The resulting live album became one of the first jazz records to sell over 1 million copies, and the quartet became the first jazz group ever to play San Francisco's legendary Fillmore. For about 3 years, Charles Lloyd was arguably the biggest crossover star jazz had ever produced. Then, in 1970, he did something almost unheard of. At the peak of stardom, he simply stopped. The quartet disbanded, and Lloyd retreated to Big Sur, largely vanishing from the jazz world for over a decade, resurfacing only occasionally, including session work with the Beach Boys, before pianist Michel Petrucciani coaxed him back into touring in the early 1980s. Once his protege had gotten the recognition he deserved, Lloyd retreated again, only returning permanently after a near-fatal illness in 1986 made him reconsider his relationship with music. What makes his story unique is that the vanishing act wasn't an ending. Once he recommitted in the late 1980s, signing with the label ECM, Lloyd entered what many critics regard as the most acclaimed stretch of his career, releasing celebrated albums well into his 80s. He effectively lived two legendary careers inside one lifetime: the accidental teenage pop phenomenon of 1966, and the elder statesman who emerged, on his own terms, a generation later. He didn't fade because the hits stopped or trends passed him by. He reached the summit of mainstream jazz and walked away on purpose, not once, but twice.